Hello, I am Tara Cushing, a fellow at the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. I am joined with Mr. Rhea, who has written some great books about various military campaigns of the Civil War. Today, I will be asking him about his upcoming book, Steven Ace Welsh, Black Freedom Fighter in the Civil War and Reconstruction, which is to be published later this year. Would you like to introduce yourself further?
Oh, that's fine. Hello.
Okay. Well, what led you to researching and writing a history of Steven Ace Welsh?
Well, it's a fascinating story. There's virtually no biographies out there of individual African American soldiers, and of course, Swails is a very significant one. He was the first soldier to ever be commissioned as an officer in the U.S. military, and he played a big part in Reconstruction in South Carolina after the war. But the way this came about is an interesting little story. Swails had lived the last portion of his life, and his family had remained there after his death in a little South Carolina town called Kingstree, which is in the interior of the state, very small little rural town. And his home had been ultimately torn down, other things built in its place. And one day back in the late 1970s, there were two brothers who were riding out in their pickup truck to go fishing or something like that, and went by the site and saw a trunk sitting there beside the road. And they went back a little bit later to take a look at it, and it was gone. Apparently the trash collectors had picked it up to destroy it. And later that day, one of those brothers went by the town dump and saw that same, that same trunk. Got out, opened it up, saw some old papers in there, and figured, this might be worth something. And they ended up bringing it to the local historical society and sold it for $75. Well, it turns out it was Steven Swales's personal papers. And letters he had sent out to people like Governor Wade Hampton, all sorts of things. The papers ended up with the Historical Society there. They were copied by a history nut, a lawyer like myself, named Billy Jenkinson. And Billy then sent the originals off to the South Carolina University there, but they can't find them. But Billy, fortunately, had made some copies of all of those papers, and got very interested in Swails, and ultimately decided it would be a good idea to get a biography of him. He'd seen some of my writing and had seen some biographies I've done of some other Civil War people. And through a series of, again, unusual events, his brother happened to live in the same town that we live in, and my wife had talked with his brother about some matters, and ultimately Billy Jenkinson agreed to talk to my wife, and she'd set up something with me. And so he and I met, and he showed me these papers and asked if I'd be interested in doing a biography, and I said absolutely. And that got me into it, and I turned into basically a Steven Swails nut, going through all of his papers and then doing a lot of research up at the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, and then, of course, National Archives and a lot of other spots, and put this biography together. So it's been a work of love, absolutely fascinating, and I'm really looking forward to its publication, and I'd love to talk about it. So that's how it all came to pass.
It seems like a lot of coincidences and fate, like you were meant to write it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and it was, and it's a fascinating story about how a book came to be, but it's nowhere near as fascinating, of course, as Steven Swales's own life.
Yes, and how do you go about reconstructing the past of someone whose history has been basically forgotten or erased? Like you mentioned the letters, but anything beyond that?
Well, there's quite a bit. First, there's a lot out there. For instance, Steven Swales's early life, when he grew up in Pennsylvania as a free black, there's very little about that, but there's a good bit out of the areas that he lived in that give you a sense of what the setting was and what he must have experienced. His work with the Army, because he joined the 54th Massachusetts back when it was set up And I think he joined in early April of 1863, which was the first major black regiment raised in the North. And then he fought in a lot of the major battles in South Carolina, in Florida, there at Battery Wagner and down at Lusty. All of that is collected up, obviously, in his compiled service record, which is the National Archives. And so that was extraordinarily helpful. After the war, he worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, and the Freedmen's Bureau records are in the National Archives, so that took a lot of digging. And then, of course, when he was with the South Carolina Senate, and all the work he did at that point with the government is in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History, and they have some extensive sources there. So it just requires a lot of digging and running around. Also, I'd done a lot of work on Civil War battles, but not that much on Reconstruction. So for me, this was a real learning experience. And so I spent a lot of time going through biographies of all the major Reconstruction figures, and then, of course, going through a lot of the secondary material that's out there. So it was, for me, it was a real education experience, and one I'm really glad that I went through, because I learned a tremendous amount and met some fascinating characters, some real mean ones too, but the whole mix.
Yeah. Sounds like you put together a puzzle of a bunch of different sources to try and like figure out his whole life. That's really cool.
True. I also was helped, by the way. There were two people who had done some research and writing about him before. They didn't have any published articles or material, but they were very helpful. One of them, of course, was Billy Jenkinson, the attorney out of Kingstree, who'd given several talks about Swails and had collected a lot of good material. And then there also was a gentleman up in New York that had collected quite a bit. And so I was obviously helped by a lot of people. And I talked to a lot of different people, experts in the Underground Railroad and Reconstruction, whatever. And so, you do these works, but you end up talking to a lot of historians just to get the background. And then, of course, I sent drafts around to other experts like Steve Wise and others who knew a lot about South Carolina, both during the Civil War and during Reconstruction. And, to write a book like that takes a lot of people. And I have to say that whole group of historians that work in the Civil War era are extremely collegial, and we're all glad to help.
Yes, and were there any surprises or unexpected moments on this journey to, make this book about Swails?
Well, I don't know. It's hard to say if there were any big surprises, but there were some interesting chain of events that took place. One of them was the whole story of how it is that Swails ended up as the first commissioned African-American officer in the U.S. military. The 54th Massachusetts, which was a regiment that he fought with, had been the brainchild of Governor Andrew of Massachusetts. And Andrew was quite an abolitionist and felt very strongly about ending slavery and about helping the condition of African Americans. And he became interested in Swails as Swails' reputation rose. Swails' colonel also was very impressed with him and wrote some good reports. And the two of them lobbied the War Department to advance Swails to the officer position. There was a lot of opposition, and I was able to find a lot of the letters and materials about that. The War Department basically said, well, we'd like to advance him, but he has African blood, and so we can't do it. And there was real concern about having African Americans elevated to a position where they might end up commanding or overseeing white troops. And that sort of innate prejudice really comes through in all of the writings and memos and letters that we're passing back and forth. Ultimately, the authorities decided, well, okay, we'll go ahead and promote him because of the strong recommendations he got, and by the assurances of his colonel and others that even though he has some African blood in him, you'd never know it to look at him. He looks like a white man. And so that to me was a fascinating dance back and forth to see. And it was really a window into the innate prejudice, not only obviously in the southern states, but in the North as well. and how it colored his interactions. And of course, the other thing that I found as a very fascinating journey was how he managed to rise politically after the war in the South. And of course, what made that possible was his work with the Freedmen's Bureau, where he was basically mediating in Kingstree and in central South Carolina, mediating the grievances and issues between the Black populace and the white populace, and doing it quite artfully in a way that won him allies in both sectors. The Black population looked upon him as somebody who could really get things done and help. The white population, though, he also cultivated that. And I think the fact that he had grown up in the North as a free Black and had lived in Pennsylvania and New York and was used to conversing with the white populace, unlike, of course, a lot of the slave population from the South, which had to deal with the white populace on a very different footing, played a big part. He actually studied law, became an attorney in South Carolina, and set up a law firm in Kingstree. His law partner was a gentleman who had been a Confederate soldier, a white man who had actually fought in at least one of the battles against Swails. So that gives you an idea of how sort of eclectic he was, how he could reach out and make friends, acquaintances, and supporters in all parts of the community. So an amazing guy and a man who kept rising above the challenges that I think would have beaten back most people.
Yes, he sounds very intelligent and charismatic. That sounds like a super interesting and complex story. So how do you think his story fits into the broader historical conversation?
Well, I think it fits in several different ways. I mean, first, obviously, he's a major figure in one of the major African-American regiments, the 54th Massachusetts. Again, it's fascinating to be able to actually follow a soldier within that regiment and watch him rise and get a sense of the huge contribution of the African-American soldiers. We forget sometimes that there were something like 200,000 Black Americans that fought in the Civil War on behalf of the Union. They played a major part, particularly as the war went on. Also, obviously, he's a major figure during Reconstruction, as the South came to grips with an entirely new social order. He played a huge part in that. So I find him to be just an interesting thread to follow through all of this. And he was involved in most of the big events. It's interesting to see how someone like that works his way to the top, does it artfully. And of course, his downfall, I think, pretty much epitomized what happens in the South. 1876 election, at that point, Washington had pretty much abandoned the South because it was costly and compromises had to be made. And of course, that was during the Tilden-Hayes electoral debates. And in the South, the white populace pretty much voted in the group known as the Redeemers, who wanted to return basically to the old ways. They couldn't enslave the Black people again, but they could certainly control them at the polls and in a lot of other ways through social legislation. And Swails was in the midst of all of that as well. He didn't survive it that well because basically he was driven out of town with death threats. I delve a good bit into exactly what the violence at that time was and how it impacted him and his family. But I think he's fascinating because he is a way to thread your way through those years and see them through the eyes of someone who really experienced a whole lot of it.
Yeah, he sounds very influential and like he was really in the thick of everything. So why don't you think like his story was written earlier, or why don't we know him with other of like the main people that we think of from these times?
Right. Well, I mean, first, he was run out of the state. There really hasn't been a whole lot of work until fairly recently into the details of Reconstruction, which is fascinating. I spend some time in the book and the epilogue and the last portion of it, looking at what was the evolution of his reputation. And there in Kingstree, it was a mixed picture. Obviously, once the black populace lost its political clout, the story was being written by the white populace. And the historians there were not all that friendly to him. He was mentioned in a few of the books, and they were concerned, one of them was concerned that because he had fought with the Union forces that were actually there in South Carolina and had actually been in some of the operations that were not that far from Kingstree, where he was living, that he was like a carpetbagger or scallywag or whatever, and not very someone that if everyone had understood, particularly the white populace, what he had been involved in the war, that he would not be popular at all. It really isn't until very recently that he's, I think, gotten the kind of publicity, if I can put it that way, or understanding that he definitely was due. And I think it's in large part due to the work of Billy Jenkinson, the local attorney who got interested in him. And hopefully this book will also bring him to the historic fore so that people can understand and know who he was. And hopefully it will spur more books of that type, because I think we need to look at a lot of those individual stories. They're absolutely fascinating.
Mm-hmm. And why do you think his story needs to be heard and understood today?
Well, I think it says a lot about our history, and we happen to be living in a time right now when issues involving Black Americans are very much to the fore. And as Congressman Jim Clyburn wrote in one of the blurbs for my book, that this book is very timely because it brings forth the story of a African American at the time when the modern movements for equality for our Black populace was really taking off. And I think it's important to know the past. As I said, if you don't know it, you're bound to repeat the mistakes of the past. And I think it helps us put into context a lot of what's going on today.
Well, thank you. That was my last question.
Okay.
Again, thank you for joining me, and make sure to check out Mr. Rhea's upcoming book titled Steven Ace Welsh, Black Freedom Fighter in the Civil War and Reconstruction.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.